turnout. And I get a good feeling this crowd is as big as it is because some of the old Surrey residents, Joy and Everett and all these characters, they came to protect their interests and they're afraid Austin's going to talk about them. I'm filling in for Tom Groge tonight, and Tom was supposed to introduce Osmond, and he's over in Blue Hill with rehearsing for the Bagaduce Chorale upcoming concert, so I'm going to fill in for him. But tonight's program is History and Humor, 1930 and 1940s, presented by our own Osmond Bonzi, and also put in a pitch for Osmond's author of this book, did for the bicentennial. And when I picked it up at the bicentennial, and I look at it again, I've learned some more things I didn't know about the community we live in. But Osmond he's a long-time resident of Surrey. His family goes way back. His great-great-grandparents lived in Surrey. His grandparents and great-grandparents lived on Newbury Neck. Osmond's dad, Claude, was a selectman here in town for many years, and his mother, Rena, was a teacher in the school here in town. So his family goes back many, many years. So he has a lot of history of the town and also the characters that lived here. Oz grew up in Surrey and graduated from Ellsworth High School, graduated the University of Maine in public administration, and he spent 40 years as town manager in Mars Hill and Corinth, Freeport, Falmouth, and Yarmouth, and a long career in public administration. He served as executive director of the Greater Portland Council of Governments. He was president of the Maine Municipal Association. He served on the International City Management Association, and he was chairman of the State Board of Environmental Protection for a number of years. And now as Osmond retired and moved back to Surrey on Newbury Neck with his wife Ann, and his family was a long-term family members from Surrey also. So I'm going to turn it over to Osmond to share some stories and some humor of Surrey back in the 40s and 30s. Osmond.
Thank you, Perry, for that kind introduction. I wasn't going to begin with this, but since both Ruth and Terry mentioned it, the book was sale. It is for sale. The money doesn't go to me. I'm not selling that book. The money goes to the town of Surrey, so just make sure everybody understands that. I want to begin. Ruth called me and asked if I would speak and try to come up with some humorous stories maybe of the 30s and 40s in Surrey. And you know, I had a chill go right up my back just as I was speaking. I knew exactly how I was going to start. I was going to talk about nicknames. And I thought of Shaker. Now, Shaker was a very famous name in Surrey. And it just sent this chill right up my spine. I thought, I'm going to start out and tell the story of Shaker. And then, by the time our brief conversation ended, that chill had gone down, and I realized, as much as I wanted, I couldn't tell that story to a mixed audience. It would just be too much to tell. Nicknames, however, was a big thing in Surrey in those days of the 30s and 40s. And the ones that really everybody had a nickname, but the ones that came to my mind right off quick were the three Whitney brothers who moved to Surrey. And you know, we still have these kinds today of people that move into the town and think they know more about running the town than the longtime officials that have been there forever. Well, this was true of Frank and Roy and Malcolm Whitney. They were three brothers who moved to town. Frank became a very prominent citizen, a longtime postmaster, very active in the garden club, was served as president of the garden club. He was an outstanding citizen. And Roy owned the store before Willard Kane owned the store. And Malcolm only stayed here a year or two and moved to Belfast. But they just had opinion that they wanted to express on every issue. And here they were new. They were from Massachusetts and New York, and they were going to tell us how to do things. So they got nicknamed very quickly. Frank was wisdom, Roy was wise, and Malcolm was knowledge. And I can remember as a kid going into the post office and having people come in to see Frank, see the postmaster, and say, "Good morning, wisdom." That he learned that was his name in his town. Now, we survived that. We had a lot of nicknames, and I should have really come up with more than that, but as I got putting this all together, I knew I was limited in my time frame, so I tried to not talk anymore about nicknames. I just want to talk a little bit about the process that I'm going to use here tonight. I'm going to tell some stories about some people, and I'm not going to use their name for reasons that may be obvious. When I tell the story, it wouldn't be a good idea. They may still be around, or they may have a relative that's around. I will, in some instances, I'll use names because I just have to. As I tell the story, I've got to tell it, you know, like a name about a guy named Otto. I'm going to have to use his name. Many of these stories are personal stories. They're stories that I know of my own personal self, or maybe I was a little bit involved with myself. I'm going to talk about how Surrey is the same today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Surrey is different from what it was in those days. And bear with me on this. I may express a couple of opinions on existing policies in our country and state today. I'll go year by year from 1930 to 1950. And for those of you who are around here in the 30s and 40s, and I know we've got several of my old friends that are here, please bear with me as I tell these stories, because I do have a little tendency to embellish sometimes once in a while. You may know better than that. I just wanted to begin in the beginning, however, with some statistical information, which I think is kind of interesting. I checked the census figures for 2004. They have now come out. You know, we usually think of them coming every 10 years, but they do it every year. Surrey census figure in 2004 was 1,360. And you know, there's a lot of us say, what are we going to do with all this growth we've got going on in town, and how are we going to handle all of this kind of growth? Well, you know, in 1860, Surrey's population was 1,319. That was the highest level it had ever been. And today, for the first time, 2004, we have exceeded that level. They handled it okay in 1860, and I'm sure we're going to handle it okay here in 2005. But the interesting thing, and the point, of course, that I'm covering is the point of the 30s and 40s. By 1930, Surrey's population was 488. It had dropped tremendously for a number of reasons. And in 1940, it was still basically the same, 497. 1950, it was at its lowest level, 448. So during that time, when I was growing up, Surrey's population was roughly 400 people, and everybody knew each other. Everybody pretty much knew every other person's business, and they got along reasonably well during that time. Now, there's one other bit of statistical information that I wanted to touch on, because it was always a thing that was of special interest to me. One of the reasons I went to the University of Maine to study public administration, because I was so interested in government. And that was the presidential election, the vote counting. And I just want to go down through these kind of quickly. In 1932, Hoover was running against Roosevelt. Roosevelt was running against Hoover for the first time. And of course, we were in the beginning years of the Depression, and Surrey voted for Hoover, 115 to 110. Pretty close vote, in spite of the fact that we were in the beginning of the Depression. In 1936, Landon, you know, he took every state except Maine and Vermont. Landon got 145 votes, Roosevelt got 48. In 1940, Wilkie got 141, Roosevelt 60. That's when Roosevelt got elected to a third term. 1944, Dewey got 117. Roosevelt got 55. Roosevelt got elected for a fourth term. And then, of course, when everybody thought Dewey was going to beat Truman, well, Dewey got 120 in Surrey. Truman got 25. I just want to jump ahead to an era outside of the subject that I'm supposed to be discussing, but I want to jump ahead to 2004. 2004, Bush got 418. His opposition got 531. Now, I want to go back over those figures for just a second. In 1940, I was 12 years old. And when Wilkie came on the radio, I'd been up, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And Wilkie came on the radio to say, I'm conceding to Roosevelt. I went to bed crying. I really did. I cried. Because I thought I'd never live under any other president than Roosevelt. He'd been there for all of my life that I could remember, and now he was going to be around for 4 more. I also thought, and this may be hard for some of you to believe, but I also thought we were going to war. I thought we were heavily going into debt, and the ethics of our government was going to continue at a low level. That's the way I felt in 1940. Now, part of my reason for thinking that way, of course, in those days, my father, who was a strong conservative Republican, always told me that, generally speaking, Democrats are homely people. And actually, the phrase that he used was homelier than a stump fence. And I was mystified by this when I looked at Ann's parents, Helen and Richard McGraw, who were Democrats, and such a handsome couple. That really didn't tie together for me very well. I just want to take another second. I did jump ahead to 2004, and I have to get this point in because I feel so strongly about it. But if I had been 12 years old in 2004, I would have gone to bed crying again with Bush's win. I would have said in 2004, the war's going to continue, the debt is going to continue to increase, and the ethics of our government is going to decrease. And so that's the way I felt in those interested. Now, the thing that I want to make here is that it's interesting to note that all of those years listed Surrey's vote against Roosevelt. Surrey voted against Roosevelt 4 times. They voted against Truman. They voted against Bush. So at least, while I haven't been on the winning side as far as the country's concerned, I'm on the winning side as far as Surrey people are concerned. Now, let me start in 1930. My father worked for Delafield. We lived in the house where Dick Gibson and now his daughter and family live now. My earliest memory in 1930 was walking out back of the garage to the toilet. It was a bit of a walk, especially in the wintertime. And you'd walk in, and of course there was the big hole, and there was the smaller hole. And there was a Sears and Roebuck catalog there to be used for whatever purpose you wanted to make of it. And the window in back, there was no opening that you could see in from. You couldn't see in, but you could see out the window if somebody had to be peeking in. The other thing that I remember about being at Newbury Neck in that time was the hand crank telephone. And we had 4 on the line, and if there was 1 ring, you knew that was for you. If there were 2 rings, it was for your neighbor. You knew who they were. And there's a phrase that we used then, and I don't think that phrase is well known today. There's no reason for it to be well known, but the phrase was rubbering. We always said you could rubber. You know, we didn't have telephone. Very few people had a radio. In fact, there was no telephones at Toddy Pond until the late 1940s. So for some excitement in your life, if you heard number 2 ring, we could say, hey, I want to find out what's going on in that person's life. We would go pick up the phone and listen in. And that was called rubbering, and that was a big thing in my young days. Now, town meeting, for me, was a bigger day, almost, than Christmas. It was an exciting kind of time, and I always looked forward to town meeting because my father was involved in that. That would motivate me to some extent, but I just loved that. In 1933, we had a town meeting that's a very interesting one in the annals of Surrey history. The first article in the warrant, always at town meeting, is to elect a moderator. In those days, the second article in the warrant was to accept the report of the municipal officers. Surrey was in the midst of a big fight. Two political parties, you might say, had been created in the town. One of them was called Tammany Hall. Those people were probably the ones in office. I don't know this for a fact. And the Ringtails. And they had a big fight. And the debate, the second article, was to accept the report of the municipal officers. Believe it or not, the debate went on for 2 days. 2 days of town meeting. And they went on and on and on, and finally, I'm assuming those then in office conceded certain errors in the town report. This was the crux of the argument, that the town report had inaccuracies. And so that went on for 2 days, and they finally approved the report, and the next morning, Wednesday morning, they came back, and in an hour, they took up the other articles in the warrant and approved the town meeting. Now, the only winners in that process, really, was the Grange, which was next door, that always served a noonday meal. So they served a noonday meal. They had a Monday night supper, and then Tuesday they had another meal and a supper Tuesday night. So the Grange did all right in that process. Now, by the time of the mid-30s, 1934, the Surrey Playhouse was getting organized and going. And I think that it's just so too bad that we didn't keep the Surrey Playhouse and didn't have it going, because it was such a wonderful event in those days, and it would be even more so today. It's just one of those unfortunate circumstances. We had a lot of well-known actors and actresses. Some of you might remember the name Anne Revere and Joseph Cotton. They were very prominent at that point in time, and they were active. One of the young people, the real young people, was Henry Fonda. And Anne's father, Richard, remembers him playing baseball with him. He was here, and he joined in with Surrey and played with the kids. And he was probably 20, 21, 22, something like that. In 1936, continuing to move along through the 30s, my father, who had been a selectman and was in first selectman that year, got a job in the state liquor store. Now, we had a Democrat. Brand was the governor of the state from 32 to 36, and this was the time when liquor came back into state control, you might say, and he appointed or selected Democrats for all these new positions with the state, working for the state liquor store. Well, in 1936, Lou Barrows was elected governor, and things changed. Republicans kind of got that opportunity. My father got a job in the state liquor store as a clerk there in the state liquor store. It was $28 a week. Now, for Surrey, that was not too bad a job. That was straight pay. If it rained, it didn't make any difference. You still were going to get paid. And so he worked in that position. Now, he was also master of the Grange. Arbutus Grange had been in existence since 1905, and it had 140 members that year. Think of it, 400 population, the town, 140 members. So the Grange was the organization to belong to and participate in. Dad was master of the Grange. So we went to the Grange and said, I'm now working the state liquor store, and under their rules and regulations, interestingly enough, they require that state liquor stores stay open till 10 o'clock Saturday night. How they ever came up with that one, I don't know, but that was the rule. And so, as a result, my father, the Grange had been meeting since 1905 on Saturday night, but he couldn't continue as master if they continued to meet on Saturday night. So he raised the question about changing the meeting day. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of debate, and they finally set a date when they really discussed whether or not they'd change it. That day came, and the arguments waxed loud. And finally, Carrie Floyd. Carrie was a beloved citizen of Surrey, served as town clerk many years. She was serving in the office of series with the Grange. Carrie stood up. She was very much opposed to changing the meeting date from Saturday night. She said, after all, everybody takes a bath on Saturday. And can you imagine how this place will smell on Friday night? On Friday night. Well, in spite of her argument, which she made some pretty good points, really, that was defeated, and it was changed. I would say also that beginning in 1937, Alton Carter was elected first selectman. He served in that position for 35 years, longer than anybody else. He had a long tenure. Now, we had a lot of characters in Surrey, and one of those was another, I've used the word beloved before, but this was truly a beloved person, Aunt Jane Connery. Aunt Jane Connery lived on the Newbury Neck Road down near the towers where Phyllis Gibson lives now. And she was highly respected and loved by everybody. In fact, my mother lived with her when she came to Surrey in 1927 to teach school at Rich's Corner. She lived there, boarded with Aunt Jane Connery. So, a reporter, and I got to thank Babes for this material she sent me, from the Bangor Daily News in 1936, did an interview of Aunt Jane Connery. And among the questions he asked her was, whom did you vote for in the last election? Vote, sniffled Aunt Jane. I've never voted in my life because I don't believe that women should be mixed up with men in politics. Men should take care of the town meeting as such as that. Woman's place is in the home. Every election, the local politicians come around to my house in their automobiles and try to give me a free ride to the polls. They're after my vote, but I've never voted, and I never shall as long as I live. It makes me cringe to see women babbling around town meeting trying to act like men. I don't believe in it at all, and if ever a foolish woman should run for president, there's one vote she won't get, and that is Jane Connery. And I have another criticism I make of women of the present day. I'm not against a little game of cards now and then, but when women sit up all night with cards and lie abed the next morning and neglect their work, then card playing becomes a positive nuisance and a sin. The reporter then said, do you believe in hell? She said, land sakes, no. All the hell we get, we run into right here on earth. Folks can either make their life a heaven or they can make it a hell. It's up to them. The best way to keep out of hell on earth is to be kind and helpful to your neighbor. And that was the story of her life. She was kind and helpful to her neighbor. I just thought it was sort of timely in view of women's rights and so forth to read this little story. Now, there's another person who was very well known during this period of the late 30s that this reporter also interviewed, and his points, I think, are also very current, you might say. Now, that person was a man named Horace Young, and I can remember Horace walking, and he always walked in the middle of the road, and he lived up at the first house as you turn the corner and go towards Newbury Neck. But he walked down to the stores. So the Reporter said to Horace, knowing his reputation, "Why do you always walk in the middle of the road?" And Horace said, "It's nobody's damn business why I walk in the middle of the road. But I'd just as soon tell you, stranger, that I walk in the middle of the road because it's my constitutional right." Now, haven't we heard that phrase today about issues? He said, "Yes, sir, it's my constitutional right." But, then the reporter said, "But are you willing to risk being killed by an automobile in deference to your constitutional right?" "I am," he replied militantly. "The Constitution of the United States was framed more than 100 years before automobiles were invented. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that a citizen can't walk in the middle of the road. Just as in the beginning, the middle of the road in this year, 1937, belongs to the citizens. I'm standing on my rights and walk right in the middle of the road." "But how about those 7 automobiles that hit you and brushed you away from the middle of the road?" I inquired, the reporter said to him. Young poked disgustedly at the pavement with his cane as he replied, "That last hit wasn't really a hit at all. Some rascal reached out with his hand as the car went by and gave me a shot. I'm not so damn green as I look, my boy. A lot of folks in this town think I'm green too, but I've fooled them a couple of times." Then the reporter asked his final question. "I should think that your wife would be worried about your walking in the middle of the road." His merriment vanished so quickly that the reporter was startled by the transformation. His sharp eyes bored into the reporter suspiciously as he ran a gnarled hand through his gray stubble of beard. "Who told you, young man, I was married?" he interrogated. "The report of my being married is grossly exaggerated. I'm 80 years old and a bachelor, and I thank God for that. And even if I were married, no wife would deprive me of my constitutional right of walking in the middle of the road. And no one in this town can stop me either." So I thought Horace and Aunt Jane were two pretty good stories to tell, sort of typical people in Surrey at that time. In 1938, as I move on, Phillips H. Lord, who has been described as Surrey's Howard Hughes, he really was quite a famous character. He was a graduate of Bowdoin College. 2 years later, he wrote a script for a radio program titled Seth Parker, with a setting in Jonesport, Maine. Many of us remember that program. Its focus was on religion in both serious and humorous veins. Later, he created other radio programs, including the popular Gangbusters. I used to listen to that every Friday night at 9 o'clock. In the mid-1930s, he purchased property at the end of Newbury Neck. It's presently owned by Hans Huber, that whole huge parcel of land at the end of Newbury Neck he owned. Later, of course, he purchased land in East Surrey and created The Gatherings, a popular summer spot for campers. That's when he first came to Surrey. It was about 1938. Now, in 1939, Surrey had the one school. I think everybody knows where that school was, and still there. And I had finally gotten up into the upstairs level. The first 4 grades were downstairs. The other 4 were upstairs. And the thing that I liked about getting upstairs was that they had a Lincoln Library book. It was a red book about that thick, and it had articles on everything. That was the book that we had for research. If you wanted to research something, you had the Lincoln Library book. It wasn't much, but that's all the town apparently could afford at that time. Well, that spring of 1939, I think, there was a track meet in Ellsworth that involved the area schools. Mark Young, with long legs, Kenneth Moon, short but quick legs, Loretta Lassard, she later became Loretta Curtis here in Surrey, and a girl named Grace McCabe went over to that track meet. they won the track meet for Surrey. It was a wonderful thing. But the real wonderful thing about it was that we got a brand new set of encyclopedias. And I can remember those light blue books, those encyclopedias that we got, and being able to walk up back, and really you could find out so much more information than you could from that little Lincoln Library book that we had. Those were tough years for Surrey. We had a boy named Kenneth Dunn. We had 3 or 4 that were pretty tough characters. And they would kind of bully some of the younger kids. And a teacher came in with the name of Philip Sodicus. This was a year or 2 later. And he had said, I'm taking control. And one day he came downstairs. Kenneth was giving some of the younger kids a hard time. Mr. Sodicus told him to stop, and when he did, Kenneth kind of took a little swing at him, and when he did, Sodicus gave him a flip right under his jaw, and I was standing right near there, and I could still see Kenneth's eyes rolling back. He fell right over backwards on the ground. Now, you know, that solved our problem. If today, if a teacher did that to a student, that would be the end of the teacher, and probably they'd be sued by the parent. Kenneth accepted it. He was here at a reunion we had 10 or 12 years ago and laughed and joked about that whole episode. He accepted what had happened. Also during this period of the 30s, school was closed for 6 weeks every spring. The roads were so muddy, we didn't have a road commissioner like Wolver that had fixed everything up. We had roads that were so muddy that there was no way it could get through. They just had to be closed. So that would go for a long time. Now, I would also say that I'm not sure those encyclopedias did this totally, but Surrey had some interesting, exciting years in Ellsworth High School right after that. In 1942, Sylvia Whitney, she incidentally was the daughter of Frank Whitney that I mentioned earlier. Sylvia was named valedictorian of Ellsworth High School. That was 42. In 1943, Helen Carter, who lived out in Conneryville, was named salutatorian from Surrey of Ellsworth High School. In 1944, we really took it all. Laredo Carter was named salutatorian, and Charlotte Ingalls, who's with us here tonight, was named valedictorian. We took both places in 1944. It was really quite a feat. Now, in 1941, well, this was true of the 30s, 40s, smelting and wood chopping was the big thing to earn money. A lot of people did that in Surrey, and there were many well-known, hard-working people in that business. There was an article in the Ellsworth American at that time about a man named Gene Connery who lived out on the Toddy Pond Road. He and Dog Kane, among others, were among those considered to be the best smelt fishermen. But Gene, smelting, caught 120 pounds on each tide. Can you imagine in a 24-hour period? He caught 120, and then he caught 120 on the next tide. It was really quite an accomplishment. At the same time, wood cutting of that type of business was very prominent in some people's circles. And the one who was the best, and I used to hear about these feats, and it was hard for me really to believe and stop and think about it. Edgar Ingalls was averaged cutting 3 cords of wood a day. 3 cords of wood each day. That's with an axe and a buck saw. Now, that was quite an accomplishment. And I read an article in the Ellsworth American that Roy Whitney, this was back in 37, but I'm sure this would have been true for Edgar. Roy Whitney was advertising wood at $6.50 a cord. So you can imagine what the person getting cutting the wood was being paid. Now, I'm pleased that Babes and Joy and Elvin are here as his children tonight. I get a little emotional when I think about, especially about Elvin. Elvin and I were the closest of friends all through high school, all through grammar school, and then high school, and then college. And he was best man at my wedding. I was best man at his. Elvin was, incidentally, the best leadoff hitter that Elford baseball team ever had. And I remember those years very well, and what an outstanding job he did. Now, baseball games was a big thing in my life, and I loved the Red Sox from day one, and used to listen to them regularly. Of course, in those days it was just on the radio. And when there were out-of-town games, the thing you had to listen to was a telegraphic recreation. And I remember well the last day of the baseball season in 1941, when Ted Williams, going into the last two games of that season, was batting .399. And the reporters all said, "You round that off to 400, that's what you can call it." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to play these two games." They were played in Philadelphia, the Red Sox and the Philadelphia Athletics. And Ted Williams came up to bat and got 6 hits in 8 trips. Ended up batting .406 for the season. And in the background, what those telegraphic recreations were kind of a Morse code. The announcer kind of had to make up the music of the game himself as he would get a message that somebody got a hit, and he's got to try to be dramatic about it and play it out. So it was a very interesting thing. Now, in 1942, 43, 44, Elmer Kane, Willard Kane, and Forrest Carter had the 3 stores in Surrey. And Dolph had been running one store. Ginny's father, Ginny Horowitz, was around here somewhere over there. And he had the store, and then he and Willard got together. They moved up to the store where Willard stayed for many years. Elmer took over the lower store. And of course, there was always a lot of friction and debate there, especially with Forrest Carter, who wasn't the most popular person in the world, who owned the other store that was on this side by the existing church. And that was the way it stood in 1944 as we got into World War II. And of course, what we were hearing was songs like "I'll Be Seeing You," "White Cliffs of Dover," "I'll Never Smile Again." And then, of course, the most popular one we always listened to, Gabriel Heder. Gabriel Heder would be on, and he'd be saying, "There's good news tonight." Finally, about 1944, he was saying, "There's good news tonight." And we knew, finally, we were winning the war. We had one major sad event during that period. Wilbur McEwen was killed on a naval ship in the Pacific. Wilbur was another King. His mother was King. And that was a sad event that we always, the community felt so bad about. 1945, the war ended, and of course you read about Times Square and all the big celebration. Well, in Surrey, there was one couple that had a little coup, I remember. And I got to get up on the hood of that, and we rode around town for probably 10 or 15 minutes. And that was the extent of the celebration in Surrey with winning World War II. Now, the 4th of July was always a very interesting event in Surrey. And I can remember coming down one morning on the 4th of July when I was a smaller boy and looking in disbelief on top of Forrest Carter's store was a huge smelt tin. Some of the young people had, again, they didn't care too much for Forrest. They hauled the smelt tin up on top and left it up on top of his store. So Forrest had, I don't know what he ever did, somehow or other he got somebody to take it down. But usually for the 4th of July, there'd be ringing of a church bell, blowing, somebody tried to get down and blow, they had an old fire truck, try to get down and blow the horn. And of course we had a constable, Frank Gibbons. Well, the fire department was in the process of being organized. And there was a lot of dissension within the town. Should we spend the money to create a fire department? Why can't we continue with Ellsworth? And then there were others saying, well, every time we have a house fire, it burns down before Ellsworth can even get there. So there was, as I said, a lot of dissension. Among those who were most opposed, he was most opposed to spending money for any purpose, was Willard King. And I remember a town meeting when Willard was always stood up back and argued against things. And he said, instead of saying, you don't have a leg to stand on, he says, you don't have a stand a leg on. And that kind of left, and that remains in the annals of Surrey history, that statement. And that was typical of the kind of statements that Willard made. Well, anyway, this one July, Willard called a couple of young boys into his store, and he says, I'd like to pass on a little suggestion to you. He said, I have been putting trash over in the cellar hole next door, over where Gene McCann's house is today, but there had been a house there which had burned many years before, and was just a cellar hole there. He says, I'm going to put a lot of trash. It'll really make a good fire. That's all he said. But that night, these two boys, I won't name them, they came downtown. There was Luther Carter, the fire chief, Harold and Red Stevens, of course, were always with him. They were kind of lieutenants for Luther. And Frank Gibbons, the constable. And they were talking among themselves, and they said, you know, tonight there's not going to be any monkey business going on in this town. So these two boys stood around for a few minutes, and then they walked down the street, got down, you might say, almost where the Bay Market is today, and they cut in back of the house there, and walked up along the banking of the cold water, came up the road in back of Willard's store, and over to this cellar hole. They had a little candle with them. They went in there, and oh boy, they said that was the greatest pile of stuff that they'd ever seen. And so they put the candle in the midst of it, and they touched a match, and off it went, and they ran back down the way they came. They came back up, stood around with all these men that were watching the fire, watching for problems, you know, and knowing they had things well under control. And these boys were beginning to think after about 15 or 20 minutes, gee, that must have gone out. The fire must have gone out. Then all of a sudden, they spotted a little bit of a flame. And then there was a big push, and all the flame went up. And the firemen got all excited. Of course, they loved it, really. And they got all excited and said, we got to call the fire truck. So they got the old fire truck going, and the siren, and it blew the whistle, and woke up everybody in town, which they were trying not to do. It woke up everybody in town, and they came in, and of course, very quickly, it was the type of condition there that very quickly the fire was put out. So afterwards, everybody's standing around, including these two boys. The firemen were talking about things. They said, we think that damn Willard set that fire himself. They said, we know these boys didn't do it because they were right here with us all the time. In 1948, I was spending quite a bit of time at that point down to Elvin's house with his father and his mother, whoever else happened to be around, and we were probably playing poker. And we decided that we would go uptown to get some ice cream. And Bill Grady, a friend of ours, jumped in the car with me, and we drove up to Elmer's store. Well, Roger was in there. And Roger was kind of running the store then anyway. And, we came in, and as we came in, we bought the ice cream. We had it in a bag. Roger kind of looked at us and winked and said, sit down a minute. Now, in the store was Otto. I mentioned the name Otto. Well, Otto was there. And Otto had a nephew, Junior, he called him, who was in my class in school and who'd gone in the Navy as I had, and we had just been discharged from the Navy. And so Roger had one of these microphones attached to the radio system. The radio was playing music. All of a sudden, Roger interrupts. We interrupt this program to give you a special news bulletin. Russian planes have been spotted headed towards Maine. We expect they're going to attack at most any minute. Well, you know, we all knew Roger, and we kind of laughed to ourselves about it, but Otto perked right out. And Otto said, oh, that's going to be a sad thing. He said, he turns to me and he said, you and Junior will have to go right back in the service. Roger comes on, said, we interrupt this program to give you a special bulletin. He said, the president has just announced that none of the young guys will have to go back into the service. They'll only be taking people 60 years old and older. Well, you know that story. That went on for at least half to 3/4 of an hour. I've always wished I had a recording of it because it was so wonderful, the whole thing. And when Bill Grady and I got back down to Edgar's, the ice cream was melting. Now, the last thing I guess I wanted to mention, I asked our esteemed postmaster the other day, I said, do you know where Camp 50 is? He said, no, never heard of it. I couldn't imagine that anybody in Surrey didn't know where Camp 50 was. So I just want to put this on. This is a new thing going on around. Now, in 1949, and I guess I should go back, 1923, Alston Milliken purchased about 150 acres of woodland up in back of what I call the Mac Jellison's Road, up North Bend, and go in by Marshall, who spoke here last month, go in by his house a mile or two. He bought this 150 acres, and he then built a small shack, you might call it, on lot number 50. And he hired a man who would go in there in the winter and cut wood for him. Well, by the time of the late 1940s, and probably this actually gets beyond the time I'm supposed to be talking about, it may have been the early 50s, this had become a little bit more of a place for hunters to go, to drink, and to play poker. That was more than they did of hunting. And this involved some of my relatives whose daughters are here tonight. They would have, I always describe, the first time I went up to this Camp 50, this would have been about 1951, the first time I went up there, I looked around. There hadn't been a beer can or a beer bottle picked up to leave there from the time, for about the last 10 or 15 years. And I always said, I said to Ann, this is where all disease in this world begins. Well, Henry Milliken, who was the son of Alston, was up there with a group of people hunting. And Henry, you'd have to know Henry to appreciate it, but Henry made a mistake in shooting. He shot a moose instead of a deer. And of course, that's just as dangerous thing to do then as it is today. You just don't do that. But he came rushing down to Ann's folks' house and said they needed help cutting up that moose and getting it disposed of. So they brought the biggest part of it down there in a barn in back of Ann's father's house and cut the moose up, and I was asked to participate in doing that. I came out of the house. We'd been hard at work cutting that moose up. And Ann Sawyer's brother, Tom Sawyer, came out of her house. And he says, "Good morning, Oz, what have you been doing?" I said, "Oh, just cutting up a moose." And Ann got very upset to think that I said that, because Tom didn't know the difference. He always thought that I was just kidding, but actually that's what happened. Well, that just about completes my remarks. I just want to say that Surrey was a perfect town for a young guy to grow up, or a girl, in the 30s and 40s. There wasn't the prejudice that exists so much today against gays and blacks. And we had them. We had them in this town. I could talk about that a bit, but I'm not going to. But we accepted them. They had nicknames. Yes, they did. That was it. And I've always said that I had a lucky life. I had a lucky life to live in Surrey. Certainly living in Surrey shows the best evidence of that, or just down the hill from where I live, I found my beautiful wife, Ann. That completes my story.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Is that right? It's the place to go.